Welcome to the Point. The legislature is taking its normal spring break before heading back to finish up a budget for fiscal 2021-2022. But the budget isn't just about spending priorities, it's also about the continuing power struggle between the legislature and the governor, largely centered around COVID-19 and the state's response. Ottawa County Republican Senator Roger Victory talked about that process. Senator, you and your colleagues will take a couple of weeks away from the legislative setting to go do work, in some cases back in the district, and work on other issues. But when you come back, there is one thing for certain. You still have the budget process in front of you. Where are we in that process from your perspective? Again, as many of the other folks that I've talked to recently, you have the advantage of having seen this process now for a number of years from your experience in the House, now into the Senate. What does this year look like?
Well, there again, it's going to be another unique process. As we've been working as chair of general government and chair of MDAR on the budget side of the appropriations process, we have now with a $1.9 trillion coming in from the federal component. The state of Michigan will be getting, depending on what estimates, $10 billion plus, and depending where those directions are going. So how do we configure those dollar amounts? So when you talk about $10 billion, and when our GF dollars is about $10 billion, but with those federal dollars, they're fairly prescriptive to how they have to be used. It's going to be a unique process. However, with that being considered, we're continuing working on dealing with our individual budgets, making sure the needs are being addressed for the residents of Michigan, and making sure, like in the MDAR budget, that we can continue to do food processing, make sure the agricultural community needs are met, general government that will fund the various branches of government in a safe and secure way. So again, it will be a unique situation going forward, and I would say dynamic discussion going forward, along with a little bit of politics coming in place, some partisanships going forward. But yeah, ultimately we'll be delivering a budget and getting that done. And just making sure we're addressing the needs of the residents of Michigan.
One of the questions that I wonder about with all of this federal money that's going to be available, as you say, some of it is pretty narrowly attached to the projects it has to be taken care of, but still, it's a lot of extra money in the state budget, and I think many people would believe it's quite necessary because much needs to be done in ours and other states for the economy and for people who have been harmed, obviously vaccine rollout, all of those things. But is it going to be difficult if you have all of this one-time money? Is it going to be hard to get members to understand that that really is one-time money and it won't be there in the next budget cycle in all likelihood?
A very valid point there, Rick. And because it's one-time money, can that money be spent that would pay a dividend into the future? And some of the prescription of these federal dollars do indicate that it could be spent on some type of infrastructure dealing with broadband. The lessons learned through COVID is the lack of broadband availability throughout the state of Michigan. And as chair of general government, right, we see the Secretary of State's offices. Of course, it's mostly being operated remotely, but yet, say 20% of the state of Michigan doesn't have availability to broadband. Are we disenfranchising 20% of the state of Michigan having those state services that are administered through the Secretary of State's office? So we can take some of these dollars, and we're talking billions of dollars. That could be a game changer for the state of Michigan, especially for some of our urban areas and our rural areas.
Well, and that's highlighted during this time, not just because of some of the business issues, but schooling issues. And some school districts ran into some real problems because even though they had virtual plans in place, the kids couldn't access those plans. And that obviously has been highlighted during this pandemic.
And even moving Michigan forward, as we dislocate how businesses operate, there'll be opportunities. A lot of folks would like to come into our great state of Michigan, pure Michigan, and they're being attracted from some of our other neighboring urban areas. And if we have broadband, that could grow our economy too. So there are some aspects of this federal dollars that we could, I believe, need to be addressed for the long-term future of Michigan, and will continue to pay dividends. When you pay those dividends, that helps our tax revenues going forward to pay for these additional services that will be needed.
You brought up two interesting issues, and I want to talk about both of them. You said in the process of the budget that could be some partisanship come in. We've heard from Republican legislators over the past year about their unhappiness, about what they see as being shut out from the process of the emergency orders that the governor and then later MDHHS have been making. And one of the few places that you have to leverage with the governor is with the purse strings. Will there be some attempt to put more language into the budget somewhere that would give the legislature oversight on some of those emergency orders?
Most definitely, yes, because that's a part of negotiations. We were elected here to serve our districts, and our constituents want us to bring those voices across. And part of that negotiations is the appropriations process. And I think that's dutifully perfect area to have those negotiations. Negotiations can be partisan.
You also mentioned your role as it pertains to agriculture in the state, and it's no secret for anybody who knows you that that is your business. You have been an Ottawa County farmer for a long time, and we saw farmers go through some really tough times with all the high water and late planting seasons. This is a little off the beaten path, but it's really important to a state like Michigan. What is the, from your perspective, health of the agricultural community as we move into 2021 and the planting season and all of that?
Well, I appreciate the question there, Rick, because Michigan is a very unique state. It's second most diverse agricultural state outside the state of California, but also some lessons learned through COVID. Our processing and value-added systems in Michigan that we process a lot of our crops was put under a lot of strain. And I do believe as we come through COVID, making sure our distribution chains are shortened, making sure we have more processing capacity within the state. A lot of our protein processing has been done outside the state. We've made some good inroads of bringing that processing back to the state of Michigan. And I think more needs to be done. And if there's some role that we can do at the state level to remove some regulations or create some funding avenues through whatever tools we have, bring that closer to where the people are at, I think that's what needs to be done, and I'll continue to work hard on that behalf.
You are also head of the judiciary, and I know that you have some thoughts about perhaps reforms or, I think you said earlier, best practices that you might like to see implemented. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, this is a great opportunity to have that voice of West Michigan chairing this important committee here in Lansing and Judiciary. There's some, as we went through this past year, we've seen some issues brought up with law enforcement, and I'm a strong supporter of law enforcement, and actually been talking to the law enforcement agencies, may they be county, state police, municipalities, and there are some things that law enforcement are, throughout the state, best practices. There are some communities, counties that have been going above and beyond. So with my role, and I think we'll be spending a fair amount of time this summer, some work groups on it, how do we bring these best practices throughout the state? So there's some standardization. So regardless if you're in Ottawa County, Kent County, or Macomb County, there's some uniformity among how police interact with the residents of Michigan.
When you think about the issues away from the budget, things like working on standardizing some of the judiciary and some of the other issues that you face, I mean, there are a lot of things that the legislature does throughout the year. And it's really easy to focus and concentrate on the strain between this administration and this legislature. But within the lawmakers' chambers there in the Senate and in the House, how would you describe the relationship? Is it as fractured as it looks from afar now because of COVID, but as an observer, it looks like there's some tension there. Is that real or perceived?
Rick, there are the optics of tension. I can guarantee you behind the scenes, in certain areas like judiciary, there's a lot of bipartisan components to them. You even saw that at the federal level, national level, that there was bipartisan work being done on some judiciary reforms. And I can assure you that it has been going on here in Lansing too. So I've been reaching out to my counterparts across the aisle and been giving them a listening ear, bringing their ideas forward. I've been challenging them with my ideas, and that's how we're going to get a product across the finish line. Because remember, any legislation or policy that's passed also needs a governor's signature on it. So with those dialogues, with that, making sure it's good legislation that represents our West Michigan constituents, but the state of Michigan, and bringing that across the finish line, that ultimately get the signature of the governor.
Before Senate adjourned for the break that we're talking about, there was a vote on the director of the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. You voted not to approve Elizabeth Hertel as the director. The Senate Majority Leader and 3 of your colleagues voted with Democrats, and she became the director. What was your reasoning in voting no?
My reason for voting no was a number of the director of Department of Health and Human Services was not addressing some of the specific issues that brought out. And one of the issues was even dealing with a local issue, a restaurant in Holland. And there were some aspects of some of the rules that were being implemented by the director, and just wish we had to be able to have that dialogue going forward. Yet there were some optics that she was out there addressing those, but when it came down to I call the brass tacks, it wasn't moved. The needle wasn't being moved. So that was my opposition to the director.
I got 45 seconds left, Senator. I want you to give me your best educated guess, having watched this process a number of times. Will this budget, where we started this interview, will this budget be done by late spring, early summer, or are we still going to be working on this in the fall?
I do believe there's some nuances of this budget maybe going into later summer, and I pivot back to with these onslaught of the federal funds coming to play. I believe a overall conception of the budget could be done by early summer, but still, as we're trying to get some definition of those federal dollars and how prescriptive and how liberal we can utilize them, I think that's going to prolong the process. Right.
When we come back, a Democratic perspective, to the point. Welcome back to the Point. The atmosphere in Lansing has been deteriorating since the beginning of the pandemic. Some would suggest even before that. Legislators want more input on how to handle the matter, while the governor steadfastly maintains the executive branch has the ability to act unilaterally. That rift can and likely will spill over into the budget negotiations that will resume after the legislature's spring break. We talked to Kalamazoo's Democratic Senator Sean McCann about what he expects when lawmakers return to session. Senator, as we find ourselves in this spring break period, and for many of the elected officials, they're back home in district and doing work, as there are a lot of things that still have to get done. First and foremost is the budget. I know you've been around through your time in the House and now your time in the Senate and have watched this process go along. Give me your assessment of where you think we are in terms of getting a workable budget, that is one that both the legislature can pass and the governor can sign, and get that done in a timely fashion so we're not dealing with it at the end of September.
Well, I thank you for having me on, and I think that's a great question. I can't guarantee that it might not be September, honestly, and that's for a couple of reasons. I think that it will be hard for us to do the tax revenue estimating that goes on, because it can be so impacted by the stimulus effect on the economy, and we're early, relatively speaking, in the process. The governor proposed something in February. The legislative bodies, the House and the Senate, and their respective leaderships have not even put out sort of their versions of what they'd like to see in a budget at this point. And that might probably not come until, it also might be honestly delayed. In a typical budget timeline, you might see those numbers come out April, and then, if we do our jobs really well, at one point there was a provision that we have the budget done by July 1st, you might recall. Right. And that sort of went out the window in the last couple of years. And that would be the ideal scenario, right? But because there's so much uncertainty and so many unknowns in terms of how the stimulus and the COVID pandemic are going to affect revenues and expenses and relief packages, it could possibly be into September before we have a good handle on where we're at. I would add that the good news, I think, is that the news looks good. There was spending when people were home. They spent a lot over their computers, and that resulted in more tax revenue than was expected at the state level. And we actually had a pretty comfortable budget situation. So it's always good to have a case where you can have a bigger pie to carve up rather than a shrinking pie that you have to cut people off with. So that's really what I foresee. There's a second piece to it, which is supplementals. And if you want to get into that, we can do that too.
Well, I think we should, but before we move on to that, I mean, I think it's good for people to understand that it's a double-edged sword. First, you talked about better than expected homegrown revenues, and that's a good thing because that could give us an idea going forward of the kind of revenues we'll have. The other side of that is there's a lot of federal money that has been pushed through the budget process, and there will be more this year, as you point out, but you can't count on that for the next budget year. So you have to be a little cautious about budgeting what could very well be one-time money, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's better minds than mine that will work on those pickles. Again, good issues to have. I don't think that it would be prudent to shoot the wad, right, and have all that money get spent quickly. But I mean, I think that there are going to be expectations that we get the relief out there and make recovery, and also I think have the opportunity to make some real overdue investments in things that have been shortchanged for a long time. And that's I think part of the stimulus thinking. But I know that the main thrust of it is to right our economy and get us back to a new normal.
Let's talk about that supplemental that you brought up, because that is a subject of a little bit of friction in Lansing, because there is federal money that has already been more or less delivered from the federal government at the end of the last year. Republicans who control the legislative process, or at least the spending process for the most part, have put some of that on the table. The governor vetoed some of that because she didn't like the language that went with it. But there's still billions of dollars that have not been allocated. And all of that money practically is designed for COVID relief, things like the vaccine rollout, et cetera, right?
Yeah, Rick, it's appalling, honestly, that petty politics is holding hostage funds that should be in schools and in small businesses and in restaurants and places where it's designed to go, because the ongoing sort of, it's used to be that if you had divided power, a governor of one party and a legislature of another party, you knew you had to work a little harder and do a little more compromise than is typical if one party gets to control all the branches. But in this case, it seems like, I can't figure out quite why compromise seems to be not the order of the day. It seems to be just this absolute power struggle of people who want to get their way 100% and are upset that, quite frankly, laws that were established years ago gave power to, in this case, the Department of Health and Human Services to cope with a pandemic. I honestly can't imagine trying to legislate our way through a pandemic, and I suspect that that's what wiser people were thinking years ago when they made those laws that we are operating under, notwithstanding that the Supreme Court threw out some of the governor's authority that had been granted by the legislature. So bottom line is, these funds should not be held hostage. We need to advance them to the places that they're supposed to be used at. If people want to put some reasonable stipulations on those, that's fine. But what's happening is not that process. It's very petty and not a spirit of compromise, and not a case where we're working together to try to help people out.
Describe what the process is. I mean, are Democrats being involved at the legislative level, or are Republicans kind of acting unilaterally with some of these things?
So, I mean, basically, I serve on the Senate Appropriations Committee, and it's a committee, so it's answerable to the leadership of, in this case, the Republican-led Senate, and similar on the House side. The chairs of those committees have dug in and said, unless we have more say in how the pandemic is managed, we're not going to release these funds that they're, for what they're intended for, or we're going to put strings on them that are basically going to be poison pills for the governor. So this is kind of, unfortunately, where we're at. And I hope that, some people have said as we take a 2-week recess, maybe heads will cool down. But really, and if you want to, talk about COVID relief in terms of like shots and vaccination, I think we're going to get to a point relatively soon where we have a good percentage of the population vaccinated. And it's really going to be just about getting funds out to right our economy and get us back to a new normal. And I think that, honestly, the reasons to hold up these funds will become harder and harder to explain. I have a hard enough time explaining it now.
We're going to come back to, hopefully, to another set of bills introduced just before the break that also created some controversy. But before I do that, I want to talk about something you're working on, and that is a change to Michigan's bottle bill. And there have been plenty of complaints about that over the course of the years. What is your take, and what is it you're trying to do?
Thank you. So, I mean, in the spirit of try and try again, and eventually you might succeed, I have proposed that Michigan expand the containers that can be covered under the 10-cent bottle or can deposit. And it's primarily driven by the concept that, people never imagined that they would be carrying water around in plastic bottles when it was originally introduced in the 1970s. And now we have this situation. So, I think we need to expand it. I think it would help with recycling. It would help with littering, and would do a lot of good. And so that's a proposal I've reintroduced now in our new legislative session. And there's some talk about, interestingly, recently we had a presentation that said, obviously, a lot of people held on to their cans and bottles, couldn't take them back during the pandemic. There is going to be a one-time influx, I think, of unredeemed bottles, people who just either put them in the recycling bins or threw them out, couldn't do what they would normally do with them. And there's going to be a big chunk of funds that would normally go to environmental cleanup and other purposes. That's on the table. And so maybe what we can do is talk about how expanding the pie, taking more containers than we have in the past is something that would be good for everybody involved. And that's what I'm going to keep advancing.
When you come back from this spring break and in the relatively short period of time that we have here left, one of the things that was introduced just before the break, a bunch of bills from Republicans who talk about changing election or election reform. Democrats were quick to point out that they believe they were voter suppression. You talked about that 2 weeks and an opportunity for people to cool down a little bit, but are bills like that going to continue to ramp up the divisions between the two sides?
Well, we can agree on some things and agree to disagree on some other things. And just seeing those bills rolled out today, they struck me. I haven't analyzed every single one of them or looked at them one by one, but they struck me as, in line with apparently what's going on around the country. And it would seem that people who are upset with the outcome of the elections, even though they had no proof that anything was done wrong, people didn't ask for recounts, want to basically bog down and make it harder to vote again. And Michigan was great in that we approved Proposal 3 and expanded absentee voting. Perfect timing for a pandemic. People could vote from the comfort of their homes. No fraud, no people voting who had died, no recounts asked for people who alleged this and that and the other thing about our elections. And so I'm really skeptical of what these bills intend to do other than make it harder to vote.
The revenue shortages due to businesses being closed has largely been backfilled by federal funds through a number of stimulus programs for this year. But the number of restaurants and other businesses that have closed may well have a negative impact on future revenues for the state. That could be a challenge for the next budget cycle, 22 and 23. That's something we will continue to track. And we'll be back with a final thought to the point. We're right in the middle of a 2-week break for the legislature, something that happens every year at this time. However, there is some hope that a brief cooling off period could bring about a more conducive atmosphere of cooperation when lawmakers return. But that may be a bit optimistic. Same concerns about balance of power, who gets to make the decisions, will still be present when session resumes. No matter, we'll follow it all for you each week right here to the point.